The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the Colorado mountainside as Jane Ellis dropped to her knees beside the freshly dug grave, her third loss in as many years. First her parents to fever, then her infant daughter, and now her husband Thomas killed by a stray bullet during a bank robbery in their small mining town of Silverdale. The year was 1878, and Jane found herself truly alone for the first time in her 24 years. "I won't leave this land, Thomas," she whispered, pressing her palm against the rough-hewn wooden cross. "I promise you that." The wind carried her words away, scattering them across the rushing waters of the Eagle River that bordered their homestead. Jane had married Thomas Ellis when she was 19. He'd been kind and steady, 12 years her senior and eager to build a life together. Their small ranch sat nestled in a valley with the river curving along its eastern edge, the perfect place to raise horses and children. They'd managed the former a small but healthy stock of Appaloosas that Thomas had been training for the cavalry, but after losing their only child to croup last winter, the latter dream had withered. Now, as autumn painted the aspen trees gold against the blue Colorado sky, Jane faced a future she'd never imagined. The town of Silverdale lay 5 miles to the north, and while folks there were kind enough, they had their own troubles. The silver mines were producing less each season, and the railroad that might have brought prosperity still hadn't pushed through from Denver. Jane returned to the small log cabin she'd shared with Thomas, her skirts heavy with dirt from kneeling at his grave. Inside, nothing had changed, but everything felt different. His boots still stood by the door. His favorite pipe lay on the table beside his worn leather Bible. Jane sank into a chair and allowed herself to weep until the shadows lengthened across the wooden floor. Morning arrived with frost on the windows and a list of chores that wouldn't wait for grief. Jane pulled on Thomas's old work coat and headed to the stables. The horses needed tending, and the half-finished corral Thomas had been building wouldn't complete itself. She'd have to learn quickly what her husband had known instinctively about training horses if she hoped to continue his contracts with the Army. "You'd laugh to see me trying to hammer these posts straight," Jane said aloud, as if Thomas might hear her. She wiped sweat from her brow despite the autumn chill. By midday, her hands were blistered, but she'd managed to secure 2 more posts. Progress was slow, but it was something. Winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving. Jane rationed her supplies carefully, knowing the 5-mile journey to town would be treacherous until the snow melted. She spent long evenings by the fire, mending harnesses and reading Thomas's books on horse training. Sometimes she'd stand by the frozen river, watching the water rush beneath the ice, feeling as though her life too was moving forward while she remained trapped in place. When spring finally arrived, Jane found herself with a new determination. She had survived the winter alone. She could survive anything. The horses had weathered well too, and she'd even managed to gentler the most skittish colt using techniques she'd gleaned from Thomas's journals. One April morning, as Jane was chopping wood behind the cabin, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Visitors were rare, especially since the winter snows had only recently melted enough to make the trails passable. She set down her axe and shaded her eyes against the sun. A lone rider approached from the north, following the river's edge. Jane reached inside the cabin door for Thomas's rifle, resting it against her shoulder as she waited. Bandits weren't common in these parts, but a woman alone couldn't be too careful. As the rider drew closer, she could make out a tall figure on a chestnut mare. His clothes were trail-worn, and he rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. The stranger stopped a respectful distance from the cabin and removed his hat. "Madam," he called. "Don't mean to intrude. Name's Ryder Shaw. I was told in town there might be work here training horses." Jane kept the rifle visible but lowered it slightly. "Who told you that?" "Fella named Wilson at the general store. Said the Ellis place had the finest Appaloosas in the territory and that the Army was still expecting deliveries." Jane swallowed hard. She hadn't been to town since Thomas's death. Clearly, news of her circumstances hadn't spread far. "My husband handled the army contracts," she said. "He's gone now." The man Ryder nodded solemnly. "My condolences, madam. If you're selling the stock, I might be interested in purchasing, or if you need help with the training before you sell, I could offer my services." "I'm not selling," Jane said firmly, "and I don't recall putting out word for help." Ryder Shaw replaced his hat, adjusting it against the sun. "No offense intended, I'll be on my way then." He turned his horse but paused. "Though if I might make an observation that corral won't hold through the spring runoff the way it's leaning," Jane felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. "I'm still learning," she said stiffly. Ryder dismounted in one fluid motion. He was taller than she'd first thought, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, she noticed, were a startling blue against his tanned skin. "I've been training horses since I was 12, he said. "Worked ranches from Texas to Montana. I'm heading to California eventually, but I'm not in any particular hurry. I could shore up that corral for you in exchange for a meal and a place to rest my horse for the night. No strings attached." Jane hesitated. Pride told her to send him away, but practicality whispered that she could use the help. The corral did need fixing, and the army would be expecting delivery of 4 trained horses by summer's end, a task she wasn't entirely confident she could complete alone. "One meal," she agreed finally. "And you can sleep in the stable." Ryder smiled, a genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "Yes, madam. Much obliged." By sundown, Ryder had not only reinforced the corral but had also repaired the leaking roof on the stable and chopped enough wood to last a week. Jane watched from the cabin window as he worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. She'd prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, wondering all the while if she'd been foolish to let a stranger stay. When she called him in to eat, Ryder washed his hands at the pump outside, then removed his hat before entering the cabin. He sat where she indicated, waiting for her to take her seat before picking up his spoon. "This is mighty fine stew, Mrs. Ellis," he said after a few bites. "Thank you." "Miss," Jane corrected. "Jane Ellis. And you're welcome." They ate in silence for a while. Jane found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a scar along his jawline and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. "Where are you from originally, Mr. Shaw?" she asked finally. "Missouri," he replied. "Left home at 15 after my folks died in a flood. Been working my way west ever since." He glanced around the cabin. "You planning to stay here alone?" The question wasn't intrusive, merely practical, but it still stung. "This is my home," Jane said. "I don't have anywhere else to go, nor do I want to." Ryder nodded. "Fair enough, but running a horse ranch alone is no small task, even for an experienced trainer." "I'm learning," Jane repeated, her chin lifting stubbornly. "That you are," he agreed, surprising her with his tone of respect rather than condescension. "I noticed your approach with the bay colt earlier. You've got a natural way with horses." The unexpected compliment caught Jane off guard. "Thomas, my husband, he was teaching me before he passed." "He taught you well," Ryder said, finishing his stew. "Those Appaloosas are some of the finest stock I've seen in these parts." After dinner, Ryder thanked her again and retreated to the stable as promised. Jane cleared the dishes, unsettled by the presence of another person after months of solitude. She told herself she'd send him on his way in the morning, regardless of how helpful he'd been, but morning brought a new crisis. Jane woke to the sound of distressed nickering from the pasture. She threw on her clothes and rushed outside to find one of her mares had gotten tangled in loose fencing wire, cutting deep into her front leg as she'd panicked and struggled. Ryder was already there, speaking low and calm to the frightened animal as he carefully worked to free her. "Easy there, girl," he murmured. "We'll have you right as rain soon enough." Jane hurried to help, holding the mare's head while Ryder freed the last of the wire. Blood ran freely from the wound, and Jane's heart sank. A lame horse was worthless to the army, and worse, if infection set in, they might lose her entirely. "We need to clean this and wrap it," Ryder said, examining the cut. "Do you have any whiskey?" "In Thomas's desk," Jane said. "I'll get it." Together they worked to treat the mare's injury, Ryder displaying a gentle expertise that impressed Jane despite her worry. When they'd finished, the horse was calmer, though still favoring her injured leg. "She'll need watching," Ryder said, wiping blood from his hands. "And that leg will need cleaning and rewrapping daily for at least a week." Jane nodded, reality settling heavy on her shoulders. "I was counting on her for one of the army deliveries." Ryder studied her face for a moment. "You still planning to fulfill the contract yourself?" "I have to," Jane said simply. "It's all I have left." Something in Ryder's expression changed, a flash of understanding, perhaps even admiration. "I could stay a while," he offered. "Help you get those horses ready for the army in exchange for room and board, nothing more." Jane wanted to refuse. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat somehow, acknowledging that Thomas's dreams were beyond her abilities alone. But the wounded mare and the looming contract deadline made the decision for her. 2 weeks, she said. "Until I know if this mare will recover, then we'll see." 2 weeks stretched into a month. The injured mare healed slowly but surely under their care, though she wouldn't be ready for the army delivery. Ryder proved to be as skilled with horses as he'd claimed, and Jane found herself learning more from watching him than she ever could have from books alone. They fell into an easy routine. Jane handled the cooking and household tasks, while Ryder worked with the horses during the day. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and he would explain what he'd done and why, teaching her the subtleties of training that couldn't be written down. "It's about trust," he told her one night as they sipped coffee. "The horse has to believe you won't hurt it, but it also has to respect your authority. It's a delicate balance." "Like most things in life," Jane replied thoughtfully. Ryder smiled, the firelight casting shadows across his features. "Exactly like that." As May turned to June, Jane became increasingly aware of Ryder's presence not just as a helper, but as a man. She noticed the way his shirt clung to his shoulders when damp with sweat, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the gentleness in his hands when he tended the horses. For his part, Ryder began finding reasons to be near the cabin when he knew Jane would be there. He brought wildflowers he'd found while checking fence lines, carved a new handle for her favorite cooking pot when the old one broke, and always seemed to have an interesting story to share over dinner. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Jane finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why are you really staying, Mr. Shaw? California's still waiting for you." Ryder was quiet for a long moment, rolling his empty coffee cup between his palms. "California's been waiting a long time," he said finally. "It can wait a little longer." "That's not an answer," Jane pressed. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I'm staying because I haven't felt at home anywhere in 15 years of wandering. But this place," he gestured toward the mountains, the river, the little cabin, "something about it feels right, and maybe it's not just the place." Jane felt her heart quicken. "I'm still mourning Thomas," she said softly. "I know that," Ryder nodded. "And I respect it. I'm not asking for anything, Jane, just letting you know why I haven't been in a hurry to leave." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings. Jane looked away first, rising from her chair. "We should rest. Tomorrow's delivery day." The Army representative, Captain Miller, arrived precisely on schedule the next morning. Jane had prepared 4 horses for inspection, 3 geldings and a mare, all Appaloosas with the distinctive spotted pattern that made Thomas's stock so desirable. Captain Miller examined each horse with a critical eye while Jane stood nervously nearby, Ryder a supportive presence at her shoulder. When the captain completed his inspection, his expression was impressed. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "these animals are every bit as fine as the ones your husband delivered. The Army would be pleased to continue our arrangement with you." Relief flooded through Jane. "Thank you, Captain. That means a great deal to me." As they finalized the paperwork and payment, Captain Miller glanced between Jane and Ryder with obvious curiosity. "Your new trainer does excellent work, Mrs. Ellis." "Mr. Shaw has been invaluable," Jane acknowledged, acutely aware of Ryder standing tall beside her. After the captain departed with the horses, Jane turned to Ryder, unable to contain her smile. "We did it," she said, impulsively reaching out to squeeze his hand. Ryder's fingers closed around hers. "You did it, Jane. Those are your horses, your ranch." "Our success," she insisted, suddenly reluctant to let go of his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you." That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner. Venison Ryder had hunted the week before, preserved vegetables from Jane's cellar, and a rare bottle of wine Thomas had been saving for a special occasion. As they ate, Jane realized something had shifted between them. The successful delivery had closed one chapter of her life and perhaps opened another. "I think Thomas would approve," she said softly, pouring the last of the wine into their cups. Ryder raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Of how we've kept the ranch going, of you being here." She took a breath. "Of me finding a way forward." Ryder reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Jane," he began, but was interrupted by a sudden pounding on the door. They exchanged a puzzled glance before Ryder rose to answer it. On the porch stood a young boy from town, breathless and wide-eyed. "Mr. Shaw, Mrs. Ellis, there's a fire in town, the general store, and 3 other buildings. Sheriff sent me to ask for help, says we need every able body." Jane was already reaching for her shawl. "Saddle the horses, Ryder. We'll bring buckets." The ride to Silverdale was tense, the night sky glowing ominous orange above the little mining town. When they arrived, chaos reigned. Men formed bucket brigades from the town well to the burning buildings, while women helped evacuate families from nearby homes. Sheriff Daniels spotted them immediately. "Shaw, good man, we need help on the north side. The wind's pushing the flames toward the church." Ryder squeezed Jane's hand once before hurrying to help. Jane joined the women, organizing supplies and caring for those displaced by the fire. For hours they worked alongside their neighbors, fighting to save what they could of Silverdale. It was nearly dawn when the fire was finally contained. 4 buildings were destroyed, including the general store, but miraculously, no lives had been lost. Jane, exhausted and smoke-stained, searched through the crowd for Ryder. She found him helping an elderly man salvage what he could from his damaged home. When he saw her, relief flooded his features. He crossed to her immediately, taking her soot-streaked face in his hands. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough from smoke. "I'm fine," Jane assured him. "You," instead of answering, Ryder pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. Jane felt the rapid beating of his heart and realized with sudden clarity how worried he'd been for her and how worried she'd been for him. "I thought I'd lost you in the crowd," he murmured against her hair. "I'm here," she whispered back. "We're both here." They rode home as the sun rose, too tired for conversation but sharing glances that said more than words could. At the ranch, they tended the horses in companionable silence before finally seeking rest. Jane paused at her bedroom door. "Ryder," she said softly, "thank you for being here today." "For everything." He stood in the hallway, fatigue etched in every line of his face but tenderness in his eyes. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Jane. Not California, not anywhere." Sleep claimed them both quickly, but when Jane woke later that afternoon, something had changed within her. The fire had been a reminder of how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. She found Ryder by the river, skipping stones across the rushing water. "I've been thinking," she said, joining him on the bank. He glanced at her, waiting. "Thomas has been gone nearly a year now," Jane continued. "And while I'll always love him, I've realized something. Life doesn't stop. It can't." Ryder picked up another stone, turning it over in his palm. "What are you saying, Jane?" "I'm saying I don't want you to go to California," she said simply. "I want you to stay here with me." He dropped the stone, turning to face her fully. "Are you sure?" I've never been more certain of anything, Jane answered, stepping closer. The past year taught me that grief and joy can exist side by side, that finding happiness again doesn't dishonor what came before. Ryder's hands came to rest lightly on her waist. I've been falling in love with you since the day I rode up to this ranch, he admitted. I tried not to, knowing you were still grieving, but some things can't be helped. Jane reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar along his jaw. Then don't help it, she whispered. Love me, Ryder, and let me love you in return. Their first kiss was gentle, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Ryder rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to replace what you had with Thomas, he said softly. You couldn't, Jane assured him, but we can build something new, something ours. Summer passed in a haze of hard work and newfound happiness. They expanded the corrals, took on 2 more Army contracts, and began planning improvements to the cabin. By the time autumn painted the aspens gold again, Jane and Ryder had become partners in every sense of the word. They were married on the first day of October, a small ceremony beside the Eagle River with only the townspeople as witnesses. Jane wore a new blue dress, and Ryder wore the only suit he owned. Sheriff Daniels, whose life Ryder had saved during the fire, performed the ceremony. You may kiss your bride, the sheriff announced with a broad smile. As Ryder drew her into his arms, Jane felt the last shadows of grief lift from her heart. She would always carry Thomas in her memory, but her future belonged to the here and now, to the ranch they were building together, to the family they hoped to start, to the man whose journey had led him to her riverside home. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the cabin that was now truly theirs together, Ryder took her hand in his. I never told you why I was following the river that day, he said. The day I found you. Jane looked at him curiously. I assumed it was just the easiest path to town. Ryder shook his head. My father used to say that if you're ever lost, find water and follow it. Water leads to people, to civilization. He gazed out at the Eagle River, its surface catching the last light of day. I'd been wandering for so long, Jane. 15 years of never staying anywhere, never belonging. And now, she prompted gently, now I know he was right, Ryder said, bringing her hand to his lips. I followed the river and it led me home. Winter came again to the Colorado mountains, but this time Jane didn't face it alone. The cabin was warmer with 2 people to share it, the long evenings filled with conversation and laughter instead of silence. They planned for spring breeding, for expanding their herd, for a future that once seemed impossible. On Christmas morning, Jane presented Ryder with a handmade quilt for their bed. In return, he gave her a rocking chair he'd secretly built in the stable during the previous weeks. For when we have children, he explained, watching her face light up with joy. About that, Jane said, taking his hand and placing it gently over her stomach. Perhaps sooner than we thought. Ryder's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. You're certain? He whispered. Jane nodded, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. Come summer, there'll be 3 of us at this ranch. He pulled her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. I love you, Jane Shaw, he said against her hair. More than I have words to tell you. Spring arrived with new life everywhere. Foals were born, garden seeds planted, and Jane's body changed to accommodate the growing child within her. Ryder hovered protectively, taking on more of the ranch work as her pregnancy progressed, insisting she rest when she would have pushed herself too hard. In late July, with wildflowers carpeting the mountainsides and the river running clear and cool, their daughter entered the world with a powerful cry. They named her Hope, a testament to what had brought them together and what carried them forward. Ryder held his tiny daughter with hands that trembled slightly, marveling at her perfection. She has your eyes, he told Jane, who watched them from the bed, exhausted but radiant. And your stubborn chin, Jane teased. Poor child. As summer faded to autumn once more, the little family established new routines. Hope grew stronger each day, bringing joy to every corner of the ranch. The Army renewed their contracts, impressed with the quality of horses the Shaw Ranch continued to produce. Occasional letters arrived from Ryder's brother in Missouri, rebuilding a connection long thought lost. On the anniversary of their wedding day, Ryder took Jane back to the spot by the river where they'd been married. Hope slept peacefully in a basket lined with soft blankets while her parents stood hand in hand at the water's edge. One year, Jane mused, leaning against Ryder's shoulder. So much has changed. For the better, Ryder agreed, his arm around her waist. Jane looked up at him, at the face that had become as dear to her as her own reflection. When you crossed this river that day, did you ever imagine this would be your life? Ryder shook his head. Never. I was just a drifter with nowhere special to go. He kissed her forehead softly. But you were waiting, whether you knew it or not, and I'm thankful every day that I found you. The Eagle River flowed on beside them, unchanged by the passage of time yet always moving forward, much like life itself. Jane thought of the young widow she had been, standing alone by this same river, and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. I wasn't just waiting, she said softly. I was learning to be strong on my own, so when you came, I could love you not from need but from choice. Ryder's eyes held hers, filled with understanding and devotion. And I'll spend my life making sure you never regret that choice. Behind them, Hope stirred in her basket, making the soft noises that preceded waking. Together, they turned from the river to attend to their daughter, walking side by side toward the cabin that had once known such sorrow but now overflowed with love. The past could not be forgotten, but it no longer cast shadows over their happiness. The widow who had waited alone by the river and the cowboy who had crossed over had found in each other not just companionship, but a future bright with promise proof that even in the untamed wilderness of the West, love could bloom as surely as wildflowers after rain.